Hi everybody, David here with VRRender. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. In this video, which is another in the Build This With Me series, we're going to be taking a look at the creation of an interior render using both SketchUp and Twinmotion 2023. I'll take you through the steps from the initial construction in SketchUp all the way to the finished project. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, everybody, so here you can see we are in SketchUp, and we've got a pretty basic build here. There's nothing kind of too complicated. It's a basic room. We still have our scale measurement here, and we've got some trees that we downloaded. Now, these objects are downloadable from the warehouse if you search for just background, and you can just drop them into your scene. They are by default about 4K, but they have a pretty low overhead as opposed to putting in full 3D trees. You can see it's a relatively straightforward build. There are a couple of things that I do want you to be mindful of, though, before we bounce over to Twinmotion. The first, and I'm going to move my camera out of the way over here, is if you're using a lot of assets from the warehouse, please note that when it comes to the styles, you can change the default style. You can see over here on the right, SketchUp comes with quite a number of them. Now, some of these are going to have extremely limited use cases, but what's important for us is the default styles and these ones here that have the logo of a fast modeling style. They'll have that little green dot. And this is important because when you start bringing in warehouse models, particularly warehouse models that have a lot of polys in them, or maybe were not built in the cleanest possible way, you are going to find SketchUp is going to slow down. So it's really good to be able to put one of these on. You can put on things like the shaded or shaded with textures. If you want to see your actual artwork, for example, you'll want to have that turned on. But the interior design one right here on the left, this I found to be very, very useful. What it effectively does is turn off the profiles, which means basically each line that SketchUp draws, it's cutting that number down by effectively half, and that will speed up performance a lot. In addition, you'll also notice a couple of other things. We've gone ahead and built our entire scene using warehouse assets. There's a reason for this. Really, it's just choice and availability. Twinmotion has some wonderful assets, but if you're doing just a strict interior, I really do tend to lean on the actual assets from the warehouse. There's also just a lot more choice. The flip of that is when we get over to Twinmotion, we are going to have to spend a lot more time adding Twinmotion materials to a lot of these assets. In addition, in terms of interior design style, we've gone for a very clean look. We're going to be using a lot of whites and browns, a very neutral color palette, and hopefully we'll get a nice, warm, inviting interior when all of that is done. One other thing that you should be mindful of when it comes to SketchUp is making sure that your objects are very flush. Great example of this is an object that I brought in over here. You can see this looks pretty nice, but when I spin my camera, you'll actually notice this object right here is floating. So you really want to be mindful of that. I'm going to go in, select this, hit M on the keyboard, and I'm going to drag this down. You want to get it where it says on face, and then that should be pretty much good to go. Okay. One other thing you may want to be mindful of if you're bringing in content from the warehouse is texture size. And what I'm going to do is show you just a quick little way that you can fix that in the next section. A lot of these objects that you might bring in without really realizing may have very large textures or materials applied to them, and this will really bog down your scene. SketchUp was never intended to have really, 4K texture maps in it. Now, there is an option under the settings that allows you to use maximum texture size, but it's going to slow things down quite a bit. So what we want to do is go to the extension warehouse, and I'm going to click on this extension warehouse, and that'll bring that up. And I'm going to type in RESI and Resizer. This is a handy little extension. And I'm looking at this one right here, Material Resizer. And click on that. It is free, which is really, really nice. It does come from the SketchUp team themselves. And all you have to do is install it. So once it's installed, you can just run the extension and it will actually resize your texture maps for you. So we can go Extensions, Material Resizer, and you can see here, you have options to select all of the materials in your scene or disable some. and you can put the basically materials to a specific size. So in this case, I know that almost all of these materials are going to be replaced with Twinmotion materials. So I put these down to 512, so just a 512 by 512, which is a very small texture size by today's standards. And all you have to do is click go, and it'll run through the entire process, converting all of your textures. Anything that's larger than 512 will be converted down, basically downsizing it. It's incredibly handy, would really speed up your scene. And it's very useful when you're going to another program and not doing some sort of internal SketchUp render. It's time to send this over to Twinmotion. And to do that, we're going to use the Twinmotion Datasmith Exporter. Now, this is available here. You can see from the Twinmotion website. Go to twinmotion.com/plugins, and you can see that we have really just Datasmith exporters for a whole variety of different software. And the one you're looking for is going to be down here at the bottom, which will be the SketchUp Pro. You can download it. I believe it downloads as an executable. So all you have to do is download and fire it up to get it to work. And when you start up SketchUp, it should be there waiting for you. To actually get this working, all we need to do is go to Export to Datasmith File. Click on that, and it will export effectively, basically a Datasmith connection. All right, let's do that. Click here, and I'm going to place it pretty much in where my folder is for my SketchUp model. All right, go ahead and turn on Twinmotion, and you can see this is what we have right now. And again, we are using Twinmotion 2023. So if you're using an older version of Twinmotion, the interface is going to be radically different. Strongly recommend that you update to the newest version of Twinmotion. This is the interface that we'll be using. It's also just a much better program and a much nicer interface. If you're new to Twinmotion, let's do a brief overview of the interface. If you're familiar with the interface, feel free to skip ahead a little bit. But if you're new, you'll see a couple of things. First, you have your actual viewport, your working viewport. And this is just the default startup scene for, a generic project. Very similar to what you get in the Unreal Engine currently. Over here on the left, we have a library, materials, objects, tools, and people and characters, and the Crystal Megascans library. Also, if we wanted to add lights, these will be here as well. Over on the right, we have a scene tree, which will give us everything from controlling the overall environment all the way to all of the objects in our scene. This is very similar if you've worked in a lot of other programs that have or use some sort of nested folders for really just organization. Very handy to have. Down the bottom left, we have tabs that can control the view for the interface and for the stats. Now, this will come into play a little bit later on if we decide we want to drop the resolution of our scene just while we're working, just to speed things up. I'm going to go ahead and hide both of those again. And then on the very bottom, let's turn off Ambience as well. Just make sure we're not on that. We can just go back to the scene. There we go. And on the bottom, we have really the primary sort of interface buttons for getting content into and out of Twinmotion. So that's going to be the import and export buttons. And then also we have controls for materials, populate, which we probably won't really use in this project, but I'll just mention it briefly later on. And then media. So controls over, really the importing and exporting quality settings for our content. All right. What we want to look at though is import. Let's bring in our Datasmith file, effectively creating a connection between the SketchUp Datasmith that you've exported and this one here. So click on import. You can see it goes blue. Nice. Click here to import. Now, you may run into some issues with, I have found the Datasmith thing can be a bit finicky to work with. Generally, it's smart enough that when you create the direct link in SketchUp, it does seem to know where to find that. And I'm not really sure how that works. But just note that sometimes this direct link can get stuck on your previous project's direct link. I don't know if that's just a bug or just user error on my behalf. And sometimes you'll just have to find the older direct link files and delete them. But this one seems to have done a pretty good job. It's found the SketchUp Build This With Me #2. And I'm going to leave everything on its sort of default settings. Collapse by material is on. Full precision UVs are on. That's pretty much it. That should be enough to get you up and running. Let's go ahead and click import. All right, and you can see here, we've got a little broken link icon here. You do have 3 dots, and you can go ahead and delete, and you can go into some of the settings. But what we need to do is actually bounce back to SketchUp. I'm going to turn on toggle auto sync. And by the way, if you want to see if this is working, you can see this by going manage connections and click on it. And you can see, there we go, build this with me. So the connection has effectively been made. The two are able to communicate with each other, which is awesome. And I am going to just hit sync here, synchronize. And if all goes well, that will send to Twinmotion. All right, so you can see our SketchUp scene has popped right over to Twinmotion. It is sort of aligned correctly with how it would be in SketchUp. So I lifted this model up a little bit off the floor, and that's why things seem to be floating. You can see our scale reference here, and our backdrop plane came in just fine. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, I'm using the WASD keys to navigate and using the Q and E key to rise up and down. And it's time to go ahead and just start setting up our basic scene here. Before that though, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the settings. So if you hit Control P on your keyboard, or if you just go up here to File, and Edit and Preferences, you'll bring up this. Now, you probably will actually spend quite a bit of time in this if you've been using Twinmotion at all, or you just want to improve performance. Just a couple of things to be mindful of before you go too far. The unit system, change it to whatever you use locally. Here in the US, I'm going to use feet. Timestamp, you can use this, really put this to whatever you want, 24, 12 hours. It's not going to make any visual difference, but more just in terms of, if you're adjusting to a specific time. Now, other things you do want to be really careful of. Graphic hardware support. I think this has been on Direct 12 for quite a while at this point. It's probably what you're using by default. Now, path tracer. We will talk about this quite a bit later on when we render stuff out. But by default, some of the path tracer settings tend to actually be pretty strong or pretty pronouncedly hefty. You may want to drop these down. So for example, my low preset is much lower than the default that comes with Twinmotion. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but just be mindful of that. If you want quick, rapid results, or just a quick idea of how your path tracer is starting to look, feel free to go in here and drop this, especially on the low preset. You can put that pretty low. Samples per pixel, I found 3 and 3 bounces is fine if you just want to know, does this thing look okay? Okay, probes. This is kind of to do with reflections. Generally, I'll put these quite low in the viewport. Just keep them low. It's going to just determine kind of how reflections look in the viewport. It is indicative somewhat of how they'll look later on, but for export, put that up to 1024. Skydome resolution, I will generally keep this low just to speed up performance. We will use a Skydome to light up our scene, which is basically a big dome that sits above your scene and provides high dynamic range lighting. Looks really, really nice. But in the viewport, you don't really need this to look really impressive. Just go ahead and put that to low, and on export, put it to high. All right. Grass fading, probably not relevant for this project, hopefully. Generally, I'll put this to near. Most of the grass in programs like Twinmotion or D5 or whatever, you kind of want to not work with these on full. They are hugely resource intensive. And so grass fading is just going to taper them off visually. They'll still be there when you render it, but they're not being rendered pretty much every second that you're in the program. Just a little thing to turn that down. All right, direct link, we're good. Save and export, autosave. Twinmotion 2023 is very stable, but you want to turn autosave on. I've set mine to about 11 minutes, and it'll automatically set up a path for you. And I believe if you set the number here, it'll just keep overwriting the files. But you definitely want to set up autosave. All right, export, VSync, all of this stuff, not hugely important. All right, the next thing that is important is the quality settings over here. Now, quite simply, you may have the best result just by asking, Twinmotion to figure it out for you, put it to auto. For me, that's going to put on everything to ultra. I still prefer just working with high. I find high works just fine. For reference, I'm using a 64 gigabyte of RAM on a stock 3070 card on a pretty old 4K monitor, which is pretty clunky. So medium to high will work just fine. If you want to drop any of these down, you can drop the anti-aliasing or the shadows down, but it's still nice to be able to see a little bit of how your scene is going to look. So high is just medium to high is a good place to be. Now, in 2023, we also have viewport resolution scaling, basically asking Twinmotion to work on a low resolution and upscale visually on the monitor. I haven't really utilized this enough, so I can't really tell you how well this is going to work, but I did drop the path tracer from 100 to 70%, and I haven't noticed a huge discernible visual difference. So that might be something to keep in mind. All right, with everything else now, we're in a pretty good spot. I think we can go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to clean up this scene here, and then we are going to bounce right up into our model. And we'll look at why is our floor see-through. All right, be right back. Okay, so let's talk about materials in Twinmotion and also address why my floor seems to be see-through. Okay, well, first thing to note about Twinmotion materials, you have a variety of different places you can get materials from. We can use the Material tab up here on the left to access really the materials that come built into Twinmotion, and some of these are really, really nice. Glass, metal, concrete, and wood are all on the top left, and you probably will utilize these a lot in your projects. On top of that, they also have some really nice plastics and some really lovely wall coverings. This is going to be things like plaster, so let's pop over here and we'll just drag a plaster. There we go, just straight onto these objects. Now, one thing to note when it comes to dragging out materials onto really your objects or your walls or surfaces in Twinmotion, Twinmotion does have this little option here at the top to determine how the texture map is actually applied. You can use from object UVs, but if it doesn't look right, you can always try changing that to cubic UVs, or you can also try changing it to cylindrical or spherical. Now, in an ideal world, all of our objects would be UV unwrapped. That is, they would have a coordinate system that tells the software how to lay the texture out. But that's kind of out of the scope for a lot of people doing architectural visualization. It's more of a, I think, 3D generalist type of thing. So for our purposes, if you run into a situation, for example, here, let's put some brick, for example. Don't know why you would, but drag some brick onto this object here. And you're getting some kind of weird seams going on, or the material just isn't applying correctly, you can go ahead and change this to spherical. And we'll try dragging out another one and just see how that looks. In this case, kind of worse. Let's try cylindrical. A little bit better. You're still getting some stretching going on. But either way, just be mindful of that if the object doesn't really have UVs, you may run into some texture issues. Now, a couple of other things to note about materials, and obviously we're going to fix that. The library of materials, these are the default ones that come with Twinmotion. You also have access to the mega scans. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. I think almost everybody involved in any sort of visualization is kind of aware of what the mega scans are. But just be mindful, you have an array of surfaces where you can get a huge variety of new and different materials. Some of these are probably unlikely to use, like coal, or gravel maybe to some degree, but some you will use quite a lot. The selection of plaster materials is really, really, really good. And realistically, there shouldn't be many use cases where you find yourself stuck for a material. The Quixel Megascans library is an incredible asset, and it's all available to you through the basically Twinmotion interface. Really fantastic stuff. So for example, you could find a rock here, and I'm just going to download this, just any of these. All you have to do is click the little download icon. Mileage is going to vary a little bit on that based on your internet speed. But once it's downloaded, you just drag it onto the surface you want. It'll take a second, but it will create an object for you. And I think it's just incredibly, incredibly cool. You can really see that if let's put this on the wall, just for example. There we go. It's as simple as that. Now, the other option is manually importing materials. And that's kind of a topic for, I think, another day. We should be able to get through on this using just the materials browser here, and mega scans. All right, a couple of other things to note on materials. I'm going to just Control Z and kind of step back here a little bit. And I'm going to look at a wood material for the floor, and I'll just talk about the material properties tab on the right. I'm going to go to wood. I'm going to grab this really nice chestnut material, place it on. And again, just be mindful how the UVs are set here will, very much kind of determine somewhat the scale. So if you find your texture, you drag it out and it looks like really, really big, or it's really, really small, most likely the issue is just how it's being projected on there. And hopefully that will help you a little bit of frustration. There we go. Now, go and I'm just going to select this. Hit T on the keyboard, bring up the eyedropper, and we can sample our floor material here. Double click. And you can see over here on the right now, we have options to affect the color. We can also use the grunge slider to add effectively sort of procedural dirt. Very useful on certain surfaces, really floors in particular, that would pick up gradual wear and tear and oils and things like that. It's good to add a little bit of grunge to there. We also have options to kind of go in here and load up our own textures, and we can adjust things like the overall gamma, so the brightness or the gain and lift. And, for this project, we're going to probably just leave things pretty simple. So just leave things as their default. You can use the UV rotation tool to spin the direction. Effectively, think of this as kind of the flow of the object, really what way the texture is being sort of projected onto that surface and how you can rotate it. Can be very useful for doing things like putting wood on walls, and if it's flowing the wrong way, you might want to rotate it. We can also adjust the roughness. I'm not going to go too deep into the woods on like PBR materials, but basically all objects have some degree of roughness, except for really like the most pristine metals. But even those will have, grunge or smudge or, fingerprints or dirt or dust on them. So for the most part, every object is to some degree has a rough surface. That's a very layman's version of PBR materials. But you do have the ability to go in here and kind of tweak how rough the surface is. And this can kind of work concurrently with the grunge as well. So you can kind of get a really nice look to your materials. You can load up your own roughness maps if you're not happy with what you're getting. But for the most part, using the default Twinmotion materials, you can get a pretty nice look to your surfaces. Low roughness is obviously going to be shinier, or we should say more reflective is probably a more accurate way to put it. But realistically, most surfaces will have a little bit of roughness and a bit of grunge on them. Objects that are metallic, you are going to want to use the metallic slider here to actually make them metallic. So let's go over to a metal material. And I'm going to grab this slightly worn brass, and I'm just going to drag it out onto these urns. And you can kind of see here the difference. That default material has a metallic slider already cranked up. Now, strictly speaking, most materials are not going to be 100% metal. That does kind of pop up to some degree, like chrome materials might be, but scientifically speaking, a lot of the materials that you'll really use, metal usually has some sort of layer on it, whether it's paint or some sort of clear coat or something like that. But just be mindful, if your materials don't look right and they're metallic, this slider will crank that. It's similar to the metallic slider in Lumion as well. All right. Normals, we're just going to ignore that and just use the default normal maps. I'm not going to get into explaining normal maps in this video, but anyway, there you go, normals. Other things you might want to be aware of, emissive materials. Emissive materials is just something that emits light. Now, emissive materials are generally going to be used on things that normally emit light. So for example, a light bulb or electronic devices or screens, anything that will give off any sort of glow, you can go in and just turn up the emissiveness. You can see here, you can also adjust, effectively, they're calling it a luminance filter, but it's really just sort of the color that you want the glow to be. Where we're probably going to use this in the scene, maybe a little bit in these lights, and that's about it. For this shot, emissive is not going to be a huge big deal for us. Okay. Now, I mentioned the floor. Why is my floor see-through? Well, this goes back to normals, and not strictly speaking the normal map, but a normal is an imaginary line that comes up off a surface that can sometimes really be used to tell a software how something should be rendered. So in this case, strictly speaking, this should have surface thickness, but it doesn't. How we get around that then is just going down to the miscellaneous tab and turning on two-sided. And this will basically fix our floor. So I'm going to select our floor material. Again, hit T on the keyboard to bring up the eyedropper and turn on two-sided. And there we go. All right, so if that ever happens to you, and it does happen, I find quite a lot coming from SketchUp, especially for surfaces that may not have any particular thickness, like, well, that, you may want to turn on the two-sided material. It will save you a lot of heartache and a lot of pain trying to figure out why materials are not displaying correctly. Okay, I think that's a pretty good starting point. We're going to go now and start applying materials to our scene. And I'm not going to go through every material that we do here. I'll pay special attention to the wood material and the plaster on the walls, and we'll talk a little bit about glass. But I think we're going to bounce forward. Okay, everybody, so this is a good time to take stock of where our materials are. And just note that even though working in Twinmotion is really, really nice, really a lot of time is going to be spent adding materials and tweaking and changing materials. And so just be mindful of that. It's a good process, but it can take a while, depending on the complexity of your scene. So in our current shot, I've gone ahead and utilized pretty standard wood floor here. You can see that when you hit T on the keyboard to bring up the eyedropper tool, it is going to effectively bring up this materials palette right here. And you can see any of these little icons that has a tick box is a material that is being utilized in your scene. You can also select these and delete. So if you find one that doesn't, for example, this one here, black metal, you can select that and just hit delete and remove it. It's nice to be able to keep this panel a little bit cleaner and tidier. So we've gone and we've placed really just some basic wood materials. I really like this. This is one of the default, I think it's ash floor materials in Lumion. Looks nice. We've put a white plaster on the walls, and we went ahead and added a sort of teal colored, this is a Megascan teal material that we downloaded. You can see the mapping isn't perfect. And if we kind of hit OR on the keyboard to bring up the path tracer, you can see it looks okay. It's not perfect, but it'll do from distance. All right, we've also added a sort of thicker, more worn plaster to the decorative pot here. And in terms of glass materials, I'm using a standard glass material here. Let's go to our library, click on Materials, Glass. So for the exterior glass, we're just using clear glass. I'm going to apply that to both sections. There we go. If you see something like this, where there's a bit of a light discrepancy, probably means that maybe there's a double-sided plane in SketchUp, so it might be worth popping back to figure out where the lighting difference is coming from. I'm just using clear glass, and I'm not really going to change any of the settings for that. For the mirror, I'm really just using the mirror material. Just drag it straight on, hit OR on the keyboard, and you can see beautifully done path tracing mirror reflections. It looks really, really nice. Okay, for this object over here, which is going to be our bedside lamp, I do have a two-sided glass on this. Now, I may change that if we decide to put a light in there and see how that functions, but right now it is just purely decorative. I've also added a couple more pieces of plaster, and this is a Megascan's kind of dark wood material. Big takeaway, just make sure that the materials are hopefully scaled correctly and that you have them set to two-sided. So now that we have our materials done, let's take a kind of critical look at where we are. You'll notice one or two differences though. I did go ahead and change out the large decorative pot and the bed. Now the reason for both of these two changes was simple. Quite simply, when it comes to objects from the SketchUp warehouse, you don't really have any control over how well they're constructed or how the UVs are potentially laid out, or in these cases, not laid out. If you're finding that when you assign textures to those objects, that no matter what you do, the textures are always problematic, then it's probably a good time to just scrap those models and move on. Now, thankfully, we found a very lightweight model for the decorative vase here. And in terms of the bed, we have a wonderful model from iMesh, and I've talked about them before, and I'll link out to them again. These are models that are of an incredibly high quality for Blender, and you can load them up, export them out from Blender as an FBX, and assign your own textures and materials to them in Twinmotion. Now, with that being said, let's go and add one or two more decorative elements, and to do that, we're going to go over here to our sort of decorative stand that we have. I'm going to go to the Objects tab, and we're going to go into the Home. And really, this is just a case of finding things that you like the look of and seeing what works for you. So we can go in and we can find decorative plants. Maybe just grab something here that we can just kind of plop into the scene. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. We don't need something that's going to be really distracting. You just want stuff that will go nicely with what you have in the scene. So let's do something like, I know we're building kind of a interior shot here, but it can be nice to just add small little things that really just kind of help sell the scene a little bit. They don't have to be major and they don't have to be very distracting, but you do just want to add little things, small little things that make your scene look lived in or inhabited. It's part of just telling the story of your scene. To set up our ambience, I'm going to go up here to the right where it says ambience. I'm going to move myself out of the way. All right, and we are going to use a HDRI environment. So you can see under the ambience tab, we've got really options for the environment, the camera, render, and FX if we wanted to change the overall look. We're just concerned with the environment right now, and it is really great that in this version of Twinmotion, really all of the lighting is under just one ambience tab, and I think that's a really good move. It kind of streamlines the process. Okay, so let's do this. We can ignore global lighting and all that for now. I'm going to scroll on down to HDRI environment, and I am going for a bright sort of environment. I don't want to spend too much time looking outside or seeing what's outside, but we do want that nice light. Now, click the enabled button, and then I'm going to go down to the HDRI preview. We are going to use a sky dome. Think of the sky dome as literally a dome that wraps around the scene, and the backdrop HDRI is effectively almost a flat plane. And I'm going to go for the sky dome. And so I'm going to click right here and go to library. All right. Over here on the left, it'll bring up this library for HDRI environments, so skies, and we've got indoor and outdoor and some for studio if you're doing product shots. Let's just go to skies. And I'm going to go for just a noon and clear, and I just want something that's kind of just going to be generically bright. We want the focus to really just be on the interior. So let's grab this noon clear 03. I'm going to click this and download. I'm going to left click and just drag it into the scene. Okay, and there it is. It does take a little bit of time to download and load up, but that looks pretty nice. Let's do a quick path tracer test. I'm going to put the path tracer back to low. We know that low is going to be very much a preview mode here, but it'll give us an idea of how things are looking. Okay, pretty dark. So what do we do about that? Well, there's a couple of things that need to be adjusted here to get this to work. I'm going to go back to the HDRI environment tab. You can see the intensity right now is just 1. Let's go ahead and crank that quite a lot. I'm going to put that up to 10 or close enough to 10 maybe, and we'll just see where 10 is at. That'll work. And again, hit R to access the low quality preview. All right, very nice, very bright. And I'm going to spin the HDRI preview. So basically turn off the path tracer and just spin this. And I'm trying to get light to really come in these windows. Now, bearing in mind, I have a wall back here, but it'll probably will be put back. So no light should be coming really from that spot. We want as much light as possible coming in from just our HDRI environment. If we look at the settings down here, you can see HDRI FX lighting. Yes, we do want that on. We don't want this to act as just a pseudo background. And we do want to lock the sun to the HDRI as well. And that means that, really, as we spin this, we're looking for light to be falling through the glass and coming in to our actual room. I'm going to tweak this and get this right. And if we have to change the HDRI preview to do that and try a different sky, we can totally do that as well. Okay, everyone. So I did end up changing out our HDRI just to find something that really had the sun a little bit lower on the horizon. Again, just easy enough to do. But you can see I've gone ahead and put the intensity at 9, and you can see it's a low sun clear one. That's pretty nice. If you're having difficulty getting the HDRI to work exactly right, just pull your camera out completely. And what you're looking for is to track the sun. You can see we can spin that with the rotation slider here. And in my case, really going for something where the sun is blasting kind of light through the windows. Now, pop back inside, and I'm going to hit the path tracer. Okay, and you can see even on just the low settings, that is pumping a lot of nice light into the shot. Let's go and we'll put this on medium to give us a better idea of how it'll look. Yeah, that just looks so very, very nice, I think. We're in a pretty good spot. In order to get a little bit more soft light in the scene, I'm going to add another light. Go to the lights on the left here. And I'm going to grab an area light. You can see when I do this, it's effectively a big giant square. Just a square that's going to drop light into my scene. I'm going to place it right here on the bed. Then I'm going to select it and just lift it right up. And try and get it where it's nice and snug with the ceiling. And in order to actually see what I'm doing here, so I can really see, I'm going to go back to my ambience and I'm going to turn off the sky dome, pretty much turning off the intensity. Now, the only light in here should be this basically area light that we just put in. Now, you can kind of see that this light is doing a pretty good job, just kind of pumping generic white light into the scene. Not too shabby at all. It's probably a little bit much. And so I can go to my scene tree here on the right, select it, and you can see I have options here now for the intensity. So if we crank that up, hit OR, you can see what it's doing. That's a lot. And we can also adjust the length with an attenuation is going to be the fall off, so where it stops. Generally, I kind of like this to actually kind of go through the floor a little bit. And you don't want it to just stop in a kind of arbitrary point. So I'm just trying to add just this kind of soft light in there. All right, looks nice. And we'll drop the intensity back. So no light and just slowly adding in a little bit more. Okay, looks pretty nice. Now, we can also go to the shadows, and if we want, we can turn those on. And again, you can see the effect that's having. For now, though, I'm pretty happy just pumping light into the scene. I think this light here, combined with our actual environment light, is going to look pretty nice. Welcome back, everybody. And if you've made it to this part of the video, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. And I hope you're finding the content useful and hopefully learning something new. Moving forward, I have gone and dropped a reflection probe into the scene. So if you're not aware, go to the Library tab and go to Tools and Reflection Probes. I'm going to use the box reflection probe and I'm going to place it right in here. Generally, this was part of the course if you were not using the path tracer in the older versions of Twinmotion. Using it here, I can't say conclusively or definitively if it's going to affect a lot of the path tracer sort of render results. But my understanding is traditionally a box reflection probe effectively limits the reflection radius. So in other words, in reflective surfaces, you're not getting like the sky reflected in those. It kind of limits the reflections to a kind of small box area. Now, we can go ahead and just drop one right in here. And you can see now, if I can just click on this one here, we do have options for size. We can make it larger, and we can adjust the brightness and sort of the transition or cutoff value. Generally speaking, for square rooms, you are going to want to use a square reflection probe. And I'm going to place mine just right here on the floor. There we go. Nice. Looks pretty nice. That'll work just fine. And I'm using the default size. Now, I have also made a few little changes here. We did close out the back wall, just generic white wall, just to have something there so you're not getting the sky reflected in. I also added one or two more decorative elements and did fix up really the plaster material on these two objects. Now, this is something to be mindful of. A lot of times, if you're going from SketchUp to Twinmotion, your objects are not going to be UV unwrapped. And so textures can really be sort of projected on by Twinmotion in a really ugly fashion. Now, I might do a separate thing on that. It's really awkward and difficult working with UVs in SketchUp, but there are a couple of like cheap workarounds. And there is a full, I think $69 UV unwrapping tool available for SketchUp. I haven't tried it, but there's another few workarounds. I also added a second area light just at the back. Can't really see it here, but you can see if I toggle it on and off, it'll just add a bit more light. And that was just to soften the shadows from the area light pointing downwards. I've also got a little bit of an empty area here. So let's add in something from the Megascans library. I moved this decorative element a little bit closer so it's in the shot, but we still have effectively a dead area in the scene. Now, empty spaces is not a problem, especially for this kind of look, this sort of like white and brown kind of look. You can get away with some quite empty areas. Corners, we do kind of want to fill in the corners as best we can. So let's go ahead and grab something from the Megascans library. You got Megascans over here on the left. And again, we are for beginners. We are in the library tab. So Megascans. And I'm going to go to 3D assets. Here's where you can go in and search. So I'm going to go search and I'm going to just POT. All right. You can see we've got some nice little planter objects. Let's download this guy here, like the look of this. You can see there'll be a brief download period. Select it, and you'll have the ability to just drop it, or plop is a better way to think of it. Just kind of plop it into your scene. There we go. Now, once we have it, we can select it. We can hit 8 on our keypad, or go to 9 for the scale. I'm going to just left-click and drag, lift that up. I'm going to take this up here on sort of the vertical or the blue axis. Okay, that looks kind of nice, very consistent with the look and feel of our other decorative elements. Let's put in something now that will act as a layer of kind of soil, and then we'll put some greenery on top. All right, let's do that next. Again, just sort of place it into my scene, and it's very, very large right now, but we can scale it down and keep going, make it about the dimensions of the pot. Hit 7 on the keyboard to switch to the lift or sort of move gizmo. And I'm going to lift this up. There's our old friend autosave kicking in. And I'm going to move this to here. Now, it doesn't have to be completely perfectly in there, just enough. You know, we can get a nice layer of soil. The cool thing about this is we can go back to the Megascans. We can go back to surfaces. And I'm just going to look for ground. We'll try this tundra wild grass. Just take a look and see if this works. Really just need something brown that will work. And drag this on. There we go. That's not too bad. Now the scale may be a little bit off, but all in all, that will work fine, especially with our camera back here. Now, go back to the Megascans, and we're going to go to 3D plants. I'm just going to find something, like, I do like some of these herbs. So let's just pick something here. Over on the left, I've already used Lemon Balm, which I think looks really, really nice. If we hit the path tracer. Yeah, very, very nice. And over here, let's just do something simple, or maybe something a little bit more vivid. We are going for kind of white kind of color scheme. So maybe we can see if there's something that will look nice. Yeah, let's try this hydrangea maybe and just see. Okay, download it. And once we download it, we will be given the option to make some variations, some 3D variations. All right, go ahead and click the variation button. You can see Twinmotion will create some, I believe they're sort of procedurally generated variations. And I'm going to click here. Now, we've got our variations. I'm going to just click on one. And once this loads in, you can see it's just populated this into the scene. We can now just place this into the pot, just like that. And maybe just crash it down a little bit so it doesn't look like it's floating. But all in all, I think that's a pretty nice looking addition. If we wanted, we could try some different variations, but just know that downloading these and making these variations does take quite a bit of time. All right, that looks pretty good. Let's move on to set up our camera really quickly. I'm pretty happy with the overall look of this. Under the Media tab, we have options for our images. We can set up video and we can do things like panoramas and so forth. Now, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to do a bunch of images. So I'm going to click here to create my first image. That looks nice. And the first shot, I think, is going to be something along the lines of just a straight on camera shot. Now, obviously, the focal length and all that looks a little off, but right now, that looks good. Go down here and hit the refresh button. And I'm going to move myself out of the way here. And let's click on the ambience. Make sure we're in a good spot with that. Okay, now we'll have options here for setting everything up. But what we're more concerned with is not the environment, because our HDRI is going to act as the environment, but the camera tab. All right, by default, there's not a huge amount here. We've got a focal length and some other random things. Let's go look at the focal length first. I'm going to change this from 18 millimeters to about 30. Generally, kind of for interiors, you want to put this up a little bit higher. You can kind of see here, even if I just dial this, the effect that the focal length is actually going to have. Generally, what I recommend to my students for interiors is to put the focal length really at minimum kind of 25, but I'll usually happily go up to 32 or 35. It really just depends on what you're trying to get in the shot. You'll notice that the higher focal lengths just also have a more sort of naturalistic response. They don't look really as distorted. This is not, 15 millimeters is not, I think, a very normal sort of way to perceive flat images for us. I just think that looks really distorted. Now, that will look fine for exteriors, but for the interior, my own suggestion for this would be, let's go ahead and just put it to maybe 30 or 32. And I can move the camera back physically. The focal length is not affecting the actual position of the camera, more or less just the sort of kind of visual distortion that you get. All right, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go back to image 1 and just hit refresh. Any of these changes that I make, I do want to make sure that I hit the refresh button here. I want to effectively bake in those changes specific to image 1. Now, we'll come back to depth of field a little bit before we go out. Camera effects, I'm really not going to mess with a huge amount of these. Vignetting, the default is nice. So if you're not sure, a vignette is going to darken the edges. It's a nice visual way of sort of recreating what you used to get with old cameras, particularly manual cameras. It does help focus the viewer's attention generally on what you want them to be looking at. But really, 40% is fine. Leave it at the default. If you want any more, it's really easy to do it in Photoshop. Lens flare, very much not a fan of this. I think it's sort of done to death. So we're going to just leave that on nothing. Now, the parallelism is a bit of a mouthful, but what it will do is basically straighten the vertical lines. Can also be done in Photoshop, but it's better to go ahead and just click that on. Again, just refreshing right here. We don't need the near clipping plane because our camera is not being blocked by anything. But if we were doing a shot like this and we kind of did want to get rid of maybe one of the objects in front, we could actually just crank that. And it will actually, you can see, carve away the objects. Very useful for carving away walls as well. One other thing that's kind of cool, the availability of these composition overlays. So you can see on the bottom right here, I'm going to turn on the grid. You can see what we have here is a really nice, basically rule of thirds. And the whole kind of crux of this is really just these focal points. There are these kind of 4 points where you sort of want to use them as really think of them as like the meeting action points for your image. It's just a nice balanced form of composition. And so I'm going to just use it here a little bit just to kind of get these kind of lined up a little bit better. And then again, just hit refresh. Now, you can adjust these, you can add more, and you can have it where it's just, single lines. But rule of thirds is really nice and might be familiar to you, especially if you're coming from, for example, Lumion, where just holding the right mouse button will activate that in the viewport mode now, or the render preview mode. All right, that looks pretty nice. I'm going to go back and put that back to none. Okay, so the camera effects were all looking pretty good. We're pretty happy. Now, depth of field, I am going to enable this, and you can see everything goes super duper blurry. Now, I'm going to pick my focus point. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to put that right on the bed here. And I'm going to leave the aperture and these guys here, just leave them to default. Now, one thing I will point out, Twinmotion's depth of field seems to have kind of changed a few times. It can be really, really strong, so just be mindful of that. There is a possibility that you'll find the depth of field is just too much and maybe you want to dial it off. I'm going to hit OR on the keyboard and just take a quick look at this. Yeah. There we go, looking pretty nice. All right, I like that. Go ahead and set up our 5 shots. So we've got image 1, image 2 right here, which I kind of really like this one a lot. And then we've got a fun little one where I'm almost inside in, effectively kind of in the decorative element here. And I've got 4 and 5 closer up on the bed. Now you can batch export these, but I'm going to just do them sort of manually one at a time so I can make any tweaks or changes that I need to. One thing to note as well, you are currently in media mode. So if you do want to make sort of global changes, go ahead and hit quit media mode. The second thing to note is if you're having a hard time setting up your camera, one thing to be mindful of is the numpad or sort of numbers above the QWERTY, so numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, can be used to determine the speed of your camera. Generally, I found 3 and 4 to be good for nipping around the scene, but when it comes time to actually set up your camera, just go ahead and maybe hit number 2 on the keypad, and that'll slow the camera really substantially down, and hitting 1 will make it even slower, so you can really fine-tune your shot. Now, the other thing to note is the outside. Pretty happy with the look of really this 4K picture that we have of the trees. I'm getting a lot of this starting ground. And what I really kind of want to do is just change that. So I'm actually going to go over here to materials. And we're not going to use any sort of 3D grass. We're just going to find a ground material. And I'll find, maybe something a little bit browner that might work. Really just something that will look okay from distance. So maybe try grass 4, and you can drag that directly out, which is kind of cool. You're just applying this material directly to the ground, the starting ground plane, which is really, really nice. All right, that should all in all look pretty good, especially with the depth of field on, where we're not hopefully seeing too much detail out there. Now, we might also want to try adding a little bit of foliage as well. Maybe just add some sort of trees to the outer section. So for that, we can just go to the vegetation tab, and I'm going to scroll forward here. Again, just hit 3 or 4 on the keypad and just zoom in forward. And I'm going to, you can see the outside of my building here. Let's go trees. And I just want to find something that kind of fits maybe geographically, that won't look too far out of place. I'm going to place them just a little bit randomly. That's pretty much our render setting set up. There's not much else that I want to or need to tweak. So let's go ahead and render these out. All right, everyone, just 2 more little things that I actually want to reference before we hit the giant render button. So the first is FX and image here. Now, FX is, it's going to be color grading, basic color grading. My kind of suggestion would be don't bother with it. Do it in Photoshop. You just have more controls, more options. Now, image over here is important, though, because this is where we pick the size of our rendered output images. Now, I'm going to click output size here, and by default, it's set to about 2K, which, when I first started in 3D, like 2K was still kind of a big image size. But I'm going to put this to 4K. And you will want to do this, I believe, for each image sort of separately, unless I'm mistaken on that. But you just want to make sure that it is set to basically 4K for each one. That should be pretty much it. After that, go to the Export tab. And for example, I'm going to set up this one right here, image 4. Its output size is 4K. And then go to the bottom of the screen, go to Export. I'm going to click on that, click on Image, and you can pick JPEG, PNG, EXOR. We're just going to do JPEG. It's fine. All right, JPEG. I'm going to leave just the refinement off. Yeah, you can see what it hovers over there and just increases the range of basically the viewport for reflections. Not really going to make a big difference for us. I think I'm pretty happy with that. Let's go ahead and just pick the images that we want. So I'm going to click on image here. I'm going to start with image 4 just because I like the look of this one. Probably my favorite. You do have the options to turn on or off real time. This is governed, I believe, by whether you have the real-time button pressed on each of these images. So you can see that little kind of dotted square in the top left corner, that is going to determine it. So, but for our purpose, since I'm doing this one at a time, I'm going to click on just image 4, and I think that's it. We can go ahead and scroll down here and just do start export. One thing I will point out before I do this though is the path tracer. And this is sort of a curious little thing. If you hit the path tracer, you'll notice, boop, that is the area light that we put on the ceiling. Now, it only appears, interestingly, in the reflection. So in other words, in the mirror. It shouldn't. Not really sure why it is doing that, but we will have to hide it for at least this image. So just be mindful of that. You may not think this matters that much, but for example, if you're one of those people who puts area lights outside their windows to blast additional light into the scene, there's just a chance that it may become visible. It's possible I've missed a setting too. Maybe there's a turn off and reflections tab or button somewhere, but just something that you might want to be mindful of. It'd be a shame to do a full, 4K or 6K or 8K render only to find you're seeing some weird reflections in your mirror, especially for those of you who do a lot of bathroom interiors or kitchen interiors. You kind of use area lights a lot in those. So just something to be mindful of. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. I'll see you when all of these images are done. All right, welcome back, everybody. So we've gone ahead and finished up our renders, and I want to go over just a few kind of issues that I ran into. I think there's a tendency when people are making tutorials online to really kind of skip over or gloss over where things go wrong or the issues that they run into. And instead, they just, show you something really nice and shiny and say, look how awesome I am. But in reality, you are going to run into issues. So let's take a look at some of the issues that I ran into that were kind of chopped from the video so you guys didn't have to watch me figure them out and see some of the changes that were made. The first issue that we ran into is the lack of UVs. And what this means is, again, without going too deep into the rabbit hole of what UVs are for 3D practitioners, it's the ability to effectively tell the software how the textures should be assigned. Now, there is a quick workaround that we can do. Here we have a generic pot. It's just a standard pot model that I downloaded from someone in the warehouse. And if your textures are not applying to it correctly, there is an extension you can get from the warehouse called SketchUV. It's this one right here in the top left corner. And what we can do is go into our group, and I'm just going to select this face right here. I'm going to go up to the SketchUV button. I'm going to click on it. Now right click on the model and go, let's do cylindrical map from view. All right. And you can see now, this is this texture map that you're looking at should be familiar to anyone who's kind of done anything in 3D. It's just a UV texture map to see how the UVs are actually laid out. But by double clicking on it, we can go into like the orthographic mode, right click and go cylindrical map from view. And you can see it'll kind of straighten the edges. This is not ideal, but SketchUp natively does not and really intentionally hides all the UV information from you. You could also maybe send an object like this over to Blender or 3D Studio Max. But if you've got access to Blender or 3D Studio Max, you're probably going to be using them anyway, and they have UV tools built in. So this is just a quick and dirty way to do this. It is not perfect. And, if we go up here and look at the top, I can try the same technique again. Double click on just this surface here. Go to the SketchUV UV mapping tool, left click on that icon, right click and go cylindrical map from view. And you can see it doesn't work very well. So we can also try spherical maps, and that works a little bit better. It's really just up to how the plugin kind of determines the surface. And you can try the different mapping tools. You can use the tool here to create seams, which again, I'm not going to go over this, but it's not perfect. And the more complicated your object is, the more problematic it is. This is partially due to the fact that Twinmotion does not feature a triplanar mapping option yet, and I don't really know why. The second issue that we ran into is really the section outside this window. I had intended for kind of this shot to be my primary shot, but I sort of ran into issues more specifically with this seam right here. You can see the edge of the plane that we brought in. And below that, we had this ground plane, but the problem was it just didn't look good in the renders. It looked like a really obvious gap. And even with depth of field turned on, it just looked too pronounced. I even went ahead and placed a lot of grass models down here, and that didn't really help because quite simply, they didn't show up fully in the render. And so what I ended up doing was moving the trees further towards the window. So in other words, these trees are now right outside the window. And it does work. It does impact light overall, but it looks a little bit better. And it's kind of an annoyance. Some of these minor problems, you can kind of spot them if you do much smaller, sort of messier test renders, and you really kind of should do that. And the third issue was this render shot. It just didn't work. It just looked bad. And, you know, that happens too. You can set up cameras and be like, this will be the coolest shot ever. And it's not. And so that was kind of the major issues. The fourth issue, though, is a big one, and I think it is important to mention. And it's something I hadn't realized. Area lights, like the ones that we had at the top of the screen, they will show up in reflections if you use the path tracer. It's a little bit strange, and it seems to have been a known issue for a little bit of time right now, at least going back since the path tracer was introduced, and it doesn't seem to be fixed, and I'm not really sure why. But all in all, you can see it right up there in the top of the screen. That is the area light being reflected in the path tracer. It is also reflected in the glass on the windows. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of something to be mindful if you're building areas like really bathrooms, for example, that you're going to be shoving an awful lot of artificial lights in. They are going to appear. And right now, to the best of my knowledge, there is no hide in reflections button, which is something that D5 does feature, a hide in reflections button for lights. So there you have it. Those are the issues I ran into. Let's bounce into Photoshop. We'll do some quick and messy kind of post-production and just kind of see if we like the end result. All right, see you in a bit. All right, everyone, back in Photoshop. So I'm going to work on this image first. And I have gone ahead and grabbed the Actions tab here. So that's available under Window and Actions. And hopefully we can record all of the changes we make to this image and then just run that action on top of other images. So I have made sure that this is off of button mode. You can see by default, I think it's in button mode. So click the little icon here, turn off button mode, and I'm going to click on Post, and I'm going to click New. And I'm just going to call it Action 2 is fine, and I'm going to change the color to green so we can see it, and I'm going to hit Record. This should record everything that we do with our Photoshop image here, and will allow us to basically play back those steps on other images. All right, so right-click, Duplicate Layer, click OK, and I'm going to do just a quick Levels adjustment, and I'll just drag that over here. Just click Auto. There we go. Nice and bright. That looks good. And right-click and merge it down. Right-click, duplicate the layer one more time. We're going to fly all the way up here to Filter, and we'll go Camera Raw Filter, which is where I do like most of my stuff. And here we go. Now, really what I'm looking for is I like the overall color scheme here. I just want to bring out all the texture. So let's go to basic, and I'm pretty happy with the exposure and all of that. Let's see about just adjusting the highlights. Bring up the whites a little bit. So the whites and the highlights will take up. And I do want to darken the shadows a little bit. I don't want it to be super dark, but just a little dash. And then we can adjust the blacks as well. All right. Now, the main focus here is going to be on the textures. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here on, let's put this back to, oh, there we go. I hit the space bar to move around. And this is what I'm looking at right here. I'm going to grab the texture slider, move that up quite a bit, and take the clarity up as well. And you can see the difference here when you crank that. It looks really dramatic and really nice. And then lastly, the dehaze. Normally we kind of can strip away some of the haze by moving it to the left. I do actually want to bring this back. I'm going to zoom out and just see the effect that this has had on my image. Okay, it looks pretty good. I'd lighten some of the shadows again. But you can see, look at that really nice detail that we brought back in. I am going to crank the vibrance, make these colors look a little bit more vibrant, and take down the saturation a little bit so it looks a little less sort of CG, that sort of kind of plasticky look. And kind of see if we crank it to the right, what I mean, overly saturated. So bring that back a little bit to the left. All right, looks good. Click on my curves. I may adjust, really kind of not too much that I want to adjust here. We can always take up the midtones a little bit. And the highlights might be a little too bright right now, so bring them down a little dash. I'm just going to grab the detail slider here, and I'm just going to sharpen this a little bit more. All right, looks pretty good. Color mixture, I'm okay with the color overall. We can move the oranges and affect the brown a little bit. I do want to bring some of that back. Just kind of bring back some of the wood colors a little bit. And we can just kind of tweak these sliders just a little. All right, I think I'm happy with that. Color grading, I generally ignore. Chromatic aberration, I might leave it off for this one. Geometry and effects, I do want to add some grain. I want to make this a little bit more noisy. And so I'm going to take that up to about half. And the vignetting that we had kind of before, I am going to add the slightest amount of that back in. And the overall calibration, I'm pretty happy with where everything is at. Looking at the top right corner of the overall histogram, things are kind of balanced. Things are kind of looking okay overall. We can adjust the exposure just a little bit more, but that might be too much. Just a little dash. We do have some pretty pronounced the whites there. So I'm just going to right click on the histogram itself and just drag it to the left. And you can see you get quite a lot of control in just by moving the histogram. It's pretty nice. Yeah. All right, there's a nice balance. And grab those darks and bring them back into the fold a little bit, just a little to the right. I think that looks really, really nice. Let's click OK. And in a second, we'll see if this has actually worked. All right, let's pause. All right, so I'm back over on this image. Really, I kind of like these images the most. And I'm over here on my Actions tab, and I'm going to click on Action 2, and I'm going to hit play. And there you go. It runs through the entire changes that we've made. It also, because we duplicated our layers, gives us a nice duplicate over here. I do find that on this image in particular, those changes, particularly the noise, probably a little too strong, but because it's on its own layer, go ahead and just drag that down. And there we go. I think all in all, that looks pretty nice. I could always go back here and, kind of change this to your heart's content, but I really like the look of both of these images, the overall feeling of texture and the lights and darks, and I think it looks pretty nice. All right, with that being said, I am going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for watching, and if you found the content useful or the instruction good, feel free to leave a comment or to like or subscribe. Those things, as annoying as it is to kind of hear people constantly saying like and subscribe, really does actually help with the channel. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.